I want you to imagine that there's an engineering company with two project teams. Each one is working on something like a launch vehicle or a new airliner or something like that. And they take different approaches. Team A jumps right in and starts building their first prototype without a design phase. Team B sits back down, gets out some paper and starts sketching and drawing, looks up figures and material strengths and does some theorizing and works out a design that they sit down and they work out what they're going to do. They don't start doing it until they have a really, really clear idea of what they're going to do. So consequently, they take a couple of weeks longer to produce their first prototype. But eventually, they also produce a first prototype. Now, which prototype do you think will be better? Will be a more developed design, more likely to succeed in the marketplace, more likely to be safe and effective for the people who have to use it? I would say the team that did the design phase will produce a better first prototype. And the team that just jumped into building it without any thinking about what they're going to do until they start doing it will produce a terrible prototype. It'll be useless. It won't fit the bill at all. Well, writing a philosophy paper works the same way. When I read a paper written by someone who just jumped in and started writing, who did not do a design phase, who did not stop and think out what they're going to do in all the detail they could before they started writing, it shows it's not as good a paper, and sometimes it's terrible. Whereas the people who take the time to work out what they should be saying, how the paper should be designed, do better. A paper, a philosophy paper, a thesis paper, is fundamentally a delivery system for an idea. It needs to be planned out. And so this set of exercises I've got in this course, starting with basic question and working our way along to logical analysis, is my attempt to sort of nudge you through a design phase for your paper. You start out by working out the basic question. That should be fairly easily. And then you move to a more difficult task, which is figuring the burden of proof. Right. Just as in a courtroom, in a criminal trial, the prosecution has the burden of proving that the defendant did the crime, and the defense does not have this burden. The defense can just poke holes in the prosecution's argument. And if they're successful in poking those holes, the verdict is not guilty. Similarly, for scientific questions, if I was to claim that there is another planet that's about the size of Saturn outside the orbit of Pluto, I have to give you evidence. I have to give you a good reason to believe it's there. And if I don't, then you can conclude that it's not there. In fact, the logical conclusion is, well, as far as we know, it's not there. And when we draw the maps of the solar system, we include an orbit for Pluto, but not for this planet X out there, because we don't know it's there. As far as we know, it's not there. So, in any factual question, the person who's making a definite claim bears the burden of proof. In a moral claim, the person who's claiming that something is morally wrong, if I was to say it's morally wrong to be left-handed, or morally wrong for a wife to disobey their husband, or some other ridiculous moral claim, I would have to prove it. I would have to prove that the thing that I say is morally wrong hurts an innocent person or seriously violates somebody's rights. And if I can't do that, it's not morally wrong. Okay then, so once you've established the burden of proof for your particular question, you will have a burdened side and an unburdened side. The burdened side is the side with the burden of proof. And that means that in exercise 3, the third exercise in this series, where you give the for argument, the argument for the proposition, you give the burden side. What argument do they have for this? The people with the burden of proof, what argument you do? And when you do that, you leave your own opinions aside. You describe their argument as they would like it to be described. Make it as strongly stated as you can. Make it as clear and complete. Make sure it is not distorted in any way. And so that's the difficult thing about this, is getting the other person's argument right, even if it's an argument that you don't agree with. Once you've done that and you put down the burden argument, move on. The next phase will be the unburdened argument. If I've managed to grade that first one and give you some feedback, that might be helpful for describing the unburdened argument. When you do the unburdened argument, you will have the burden argument clearly in mind, because the unburdened argument is usually a matter, not always, but usually, a matter of breaking down the burdened argument. Two ways to attack an argument. One is to raise doubts about the evidence. There's factual claims. Maybe those claims are not as well supported as they should be. Maybe there's evidence against them. All right? There's reasons to think that they're not true, or at least reasons to think, or at least it might be the case that we don't really have a reason to think that they're true. If something's an unsupported claim, it can't be used in an argument. You can't just make up stuff and say, hey, this supports my conclusion, so you should believe it, right? Give me a reason. Where's the evidence? The other way to attack an argument is to break the connection between the factual claims and the conclusion. It may be true that these actually are the facts. Your factual claims may actually be true, but perhaps it's possible for your conclusion to be false, even if those claims are true. If it's possible for the conclusion of an argument to be false, even if the factual claims given in the argument are true, then the argument is no good. So that's one of the ways. Those are the ways that the unburdened side can attack the burdened side. Now, again, this is not necessarily your analysis. This is not necessarily your position. You put your own feelings and ideas aside and describe the opposing argument, the unburdened argument, as clearly and completely and as charitably as you can. And charitably means giving it a fair shake, describing it the way its proponents would like it to hear it described. Right. Final thing is the logical analysis, is where you look at the burden argument, the unburdened argument, compare them, think about them, which one succeeds, which one doesn't. Does the unburdened argument succeed in bringing down the burden argument? If it does, the burden argument is weak and falls down. If it doesn't, the unburdened argument is the one that's weak and falls down. They can't both be right. One of them has to be wrong. And your problem is figuring out which one it is based on logic, not on feelings, on logic, on evidence and the implications of evidence. So once you've done that, and you figured out which argument is weaker, which argument falls down, the one that is still standing is going to be your thesis argument for your paper. And so once these exercises are complete and you've read my feedback, because you may have to change something here and there, right? Once you've gone through this process and you know which argument, as best you can tell at this point in time, which argument is stronger, that's the one that doesn't fall down under analysis. The conclusion of this stronger argument will be the thesis of your paper. So you've completed the design phase and you move on to writing the paper. Right? If you've done the design phase, if you've done these exercises and thought about them and thought about any feedback I've given you, you should then have an armature for your paper. An armature is a rigid structure that supports everything else. In sculpture, it's a rigid structure inside the stone or inside the cement or plaster or clay or whatever it is that's, that the sculpture's made out of. There are rifles built on an armature that everything is supported by. So that's the armature, the rigid structure that holds up the paper. The logic of the issue is the armature of your paper. And once you've got that, writing the paper should be a doddle. It should be easy because you already know everything that you're really going to need to write, and all you have to think about is the best way to phrase it. Organization is simple, right? Whichever argument succeeded, we'll call that the pro argument, or the winning argument, right? The conclusion of the winning argument is the thesis of your paper. And you write a paragraph explaining that thesis. You might put in some background information if you really think it's necessary. You put in some clarifying comments. You might put in a contrast claim where you say, this is what it says, but I'm not saying this and I'm not saying that. Just a matter of making it clear. The thesis paragraph pretty much makes your thesis clear. Second paragraph, whichever argument won. Was it the burden argument or the unburdened argument? If the burden argument broke down under analysis and failed, you give the unburdened argument as your pro argument in your paper. So you state that argument clearly and completely as your second paragraph or second section. If you need an extra paragraph, take an extra paragraph, whatever you need. Third section, you've got an argument that failed under analysis. You need to state that argument as your third section, but you state it clearly and completely. And again, you state it the way its proponents would want to see it stated. Do not distort it. There are some people who are taught to caricature the argument to make it easy to fake a refutation of it. But that's dishonest. You want to be as honest as possible. You've got to maintain integrity, and you explain that argument that failed as clearly and completely and charitably as you can, so that no one who was on that side could look at what you say and say, no, that's not what we said. Then, last paragraph, with that failed argument in mind, you explain why you think it failed, the reason you rejected it in the first place. You just explain that. And that's the end of your paper. And so the paper writing phrase is merely you taking the armature you created in your pre-writing, which is 80% of the work of writing is the pre-writing, and then you just explain it. If you come across a mistake where you think, oh, you know what? I was wrong about this. You kind of reorganize the armature and write the paper on this new basis. Never be afraid to discard a draft. Never be afraid to start over again. It is actually more work and less effective to redo a previous draft than it is to just start with a blank document, write down your new thesis, your new argument. That will actually go quicker, and it will be easier than trying to change an existing paper. Okay then, so that's the sequence. Pre-writing puts you in a position to have an armature for your paper. All the questions are answered or worked out, or mostly worked out as best you can. Then you move on to writing the paper, and writing the paper should be easy because you've already done all the cognitive work in your pre-writing phase. Okay then, happy writing.